welcome to another episode of the Yalla Show. And today we have amazing millennial guests. We're going to be talking about the Arab identity crisis and what it means to be a third culture millennial. So, before we begin, how about we go around the room, say how your name is supposed to be pronounced and how others pronounce it.
Oh, that's hard.
Marwa, let's go with
you want the Arabic version, the English version?
Let's do your Arabic version first and how people then pronounce it.
Okay. So my first name is kind of easy, so Marwa, or a lot of people would say Marwa in English, but my last name is the hard part. So in Arabic it's Khubbiye, in English it's Kobe. So they're like, are you Kobe? Are you like what? I'm like, yeah, kind of, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
What about you?
My name is Saeed, and a lot of people have trouble with the A sound. So they say Sayed, Syed, Said. And when I go to coffee shops, I go by Sam.
Sam!
That's easy.
That's your Starbucks name?
Actually, yes. My Starbucks name is Maria, so that's, yeah. It's easier, yeah.
Wow. All right.
My name is Reem. It's easy to say like my first name as well, so it's Reem. But my last name has an A, so it's El-Aju, but it's Alaju.
Alaju.
Or
I like that.
Alaju. I just give up and I usually just spell it out.
Okay.
Even my first name when I go to Starbucks, I'm just like R-E-E-M. Yeah, just to make life easier.
Life tips right there. Spell out your name on Starbucks. And what about you?
Hassan, obviously very difficult to pronounce the ha. So people always call me Hassan or Hassan or Hussein. So the H is really difficult, but it's Hassan. My last name is easy, Rasmi, so people just call me Rasmi. That's easy.
Do you actually bother correcting them, or you're like?
Oh, 100%. I do it all the time.
Oh, you do?
Whenever if you call me right now and I don't pick up my phone, it's gonna be, hi, you've reached Hassan Rasmi. It's very specific.
I recorded my voicemail for that exact reason. Because I'm like, I don't know how to say my last name to make it sound like understandable. So I've never recorded my voicemail.
So
I just have my phone number, 647-8. That's it. I don't actually say my name because I'm like, I don't know if they're gonna understand.
I called my sister once and then I realized her voicemail was, hi, you've reached Farah Rasmi, and I left her the sassiest voicemail ever received. I was like, Farah Rasmi is not your name. Your name is Farah Rasmi.
Oh man, that's so funny. Because I feel like you do that unintentionally, right? Like she's probably not like, oh, let me make this easier, but she like, because so many people are like, oh, Farah Rasmi. Hey, my name, you've reached Farah Rasmi.
In fairness, a lot of people try to actually ask first too. Like a lot of people that meet me try to ask how to pronounce it, which I think is very nice.
Yeah, it is great. What about you, Hani? Do you find any?
Like one of you have like good first names or a good last name. For me, they butcher both names. It's like Hani is how it's pronounced. I get Hani. I remember first day in law school, I raised my hand and with the professor in property class, he's like, honey. And everyone's like, okay, I
thought your name is easy.
I know, like, hey,
it's sweet.
I said, buy me dinner first, then call me later. I'll take it. And then my last name is Al-Dajani. So a lot of people, like that wouldn't be like, they try to write my name. So Hani Al-Dajani, or sometimes I get Dajani. But that one I let it slide.
It's okay. It's okay.
You're like a condiment, honey Dijon.
Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
So on that note, let's now get digging into the actual topic and this whole idea of Arab identity crisis, where you have these different types of forces. And so first, like, is that a thing? Is like an Arab identity crisis something you've experienced?
It's what I live with every day.
Dang.
I'm impressive.
You gotta tell us a little more.
Am I starting right now?
Go ahead.
No, it's a big problem because growing up, I was born and raised in Egypt, and I left there end of being 17, turning 18. So it was still a relatively young age, and I left alone. So when I came, everything changed. So then like keeping that identity, like what I've grown up with and like I've been my whole life, versus coming to a country that's entirely different and having to not only adapt to that but also learn from it, creates a conflict by default. And then eventually you get to the point where you're not 100% Egyptian and you're not 100% Canadian, and you're kind of like lost in between. So that's, I think, what the identity crisis is, that I've experienced.
So you're not too Egyptian, you're not too like Canadian. What about anyone else?
I mean, I was raised in Saudi Arabia, so like over there it's kind of like super diverse. So you're always surrounded by people from like so many different areas. So I think the only, like I feel like this identity crisis came into play about 4 years ago when I actually moved here. Back in Saudi and in Jordan, I feel like, well in Jordan, realistically the majority is probably either Palestinian or Jordanian. So it doesn't necessarily come into play. But I think in Saudi as well, you're so used to being surrounded by so many different people, so it also doesn't necessarily like come into play as much. But I think here is where I was just like, wait, so like what? What am I? So like where do I, like, how am I defined, right? Am I defined by being raised in Saudi, or those 2 years that I lived in Jordan, or the past 4 years, or the fact that I was born in the States? Like it's so random, and often when I say that, people are like, oh, you're so like international, and I'm just like, yeah, but I'm Palestinian. Like, as far as it goes, like I'm more Arab than you can ever imagine. So it's definitely been here where it was just like interesting, kind of talking to people and figuring out, okay, no, I'm just Palestinian. That's about it.
So that's interesting. You mentioned that you're Palestinian.
Yeah.
So how do you then identify? Like, hey, my name is Reem Al Ajwa. I am Palestinian.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people would ask, they're like, have you ever lived there?
Yes.
Then how are you, like, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly. For me, I would say, I always get that question all the time, and when I first got here, when I first got to Canada, like recently, my answer would automatically be, yeah, no, I'm Palestinian. And so everybody in school would assume that I'm an international kid. And I'm like, no, I'm Canadian, but I'm assuming you're asking me what's my background, right? A year in, I started realizing that that question means so many different things for so many different people. It's like, I could go to you and you could be like, oh yeah, no, I'm from Egypt, or you could say I'm Canadian because you were raised here. For me, it's like you're asking me about my background and what I maybe was told at a young age to claim has always been Palestine. Like Palestine, although I've never lived in Palestine, no. It's always been something that my parents always made an effort to make sure that, yeah, you are Palestinian.
This is your identity.
This is who you are, this is the culture. Then again, Palestinian and Jordanian culture is very similar, like it's very close.
That's true.
So it was easy in terms of assimilating to the culture, but it's always been something that I was personally raised with, and it's why I continue to identify as Palestinian, although I am also Canadian.
I was gonna say, it doesn't sound like you have a crisis at all. It sounds like you're very confident.
I'm
I love it. You're very confident.
I think the crisis, because to me, the crisis also comes when you're talking to other people. I think for me, the issue is when I'm talking to other people, it's not what I believe in myself. It's not what I see myself as. It's that conversation. Oh, you don't look Arab. Like I'd be at like my own like Middle Eastern events or something along those lines, and people are just like, oh no, you don't act Arab. The way that you talk and the way that you carry yourself, that's not Arab. And I'm just like, what does that even mean?
I was gonna say,
what are you talking about? Yeah. What do you mean? And then also, how can you tell me, who you probably are not an Arab, that I'm not acting like an Arab? So where did you get that from?
Because people love to stereotype. They love to label others and live by that.
So I think it's more, to me, it's not necessarily what I believe in myself, but it's now where I've come to question it. It's like, oh, like when people say, like, oh, but you never lived in Palestine. I'm like, yeah, but are you going to tell me that makes me less Palestinian than you because I didn't live there?
So do you feel like it's one of those things like you can identify with whatever way you want to identify, whether it's with your roots or your blood?
I thought this would be my concluding statement.
Yeah. No, that's what it sounds like.
Now, I believe, and something that I live by, and I say this to so many people,
yeah.
You cannot tell me what I identify as.
So
Nobody can tell anybody what they identify as. I don't believe in that. I believe that at the end of the day, you identify as what you believe you belong to or whatever.
That's super interesting, but does it make sense?
Yeah.
So can you today decide that you identify as someone who is Chinese?
No, see, that's the thing. It has to, like, at the end of the day, like, I'm not gonna stand here and say, oh yeah, I'm Chinese, when I have nothing to do with the culture, the people, the whatever. But I think of someone actually, funny enough, my roommate, her background is Indian, but her and her mom has lived in Mozambique their entire life. If you ask her where she's from, she is African, 100%. She does not she has no connect, sure, there's a bit of the culture that's relevant to them and that comes into play into their life, but everything else, she is Mozambican straight.
Yeah. So that connection makes sense to me. That's why I asked, would it make sense, to say, in a blanket, whether you can tell people what they identify?
It's not like black or white like that. Like, it's definitely, it has to make sense. I don't see people, like I've never seen that happen personally.
I have. On TV. What's that woman called?
There are some extreme cases.
Yeah,
but,
this,
like,
yeah.
I think what you're saying, it's about like lived experience.
Yeah.
And
I
having
get-
also your values and culture and
Yeah,
what you carry
definitely.
also identifies you, like defines who you are as a person now.
So this is very interesting.
I
I
think
want
the crisis happens when someone kind of questions it or
Yeah.
tries to get you to rethink. Like, wait, so how Lebanese are you, Saeed? I'm like, I feel pretty Lebanese, but now that you mentioned that, you know, I like my
Exactly.
personal space bubble
Yeah.
and I don't smoke shisha, I'm like, wait, so am I still Lebanese? So then I'm like, why am I thinking
Thanks,
about
Ashish.
this?
That's
Oh,
true.
definitely.
That's true.
So this is actually a very interesting point. So it kind of goes to like saying like what your parents think of you, and a lot of people in our generation, like our parents, when we move here and we grow up here, it's like, oh, خلاص صاروا Canadian.
Yeah.
Like
He's
we
lost.
lost.
Yeah,
exactly, we lost. And then and even when you go back home, same exact thing. And then when you go, let's say in school, and let's say you're predominantly with like Caucasians and everyone, then automatically like this guy is like not really Canadian.
Yeah.
And then to you, you're like, yo, I'm kind of Canadian,
But I'm also Arab,
Arab,
yeah.
and like not kind of, I am Canadian and I am Arab. And
Yeah.
like, how do you then reconcile those two differences?
I think, to be honest, it's like for me, it took me a while to kind of re-evaluate everything that I'm born in Cyprus, raised in Montreal, grew up in Syria, lived in Montreal again, then here Toronto. So it's like, and my mom is Kurdish, my dad is Arab. And I'm like, I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
So for me, it really depends on who is asking. I kind of know how to answer. Let's say if I'm here, everybody's like, oh, where you're from? Or if they know that I'm not aware of certain cities here in the GTA, I'm like, oh, I'm like, I'm like, oh, I'm from Montreal. And then I go on with the conversation. But if an Arab is asking me, that means they want my family tree and they want to know who my grandfather is and
Your
who my
last
mom
name
is, everything. Yeah.
But how do you answer that question to yourself?
I honestly still, until this day, do not have an answer. That's the honest. I genuinely have no idea how to reconcile it. I don't think it's reconcilable.
But why?
Because I think it's so dissected in my head, and no matter, like, I don't know how to mix that together aside from literally looking in the mirror and being like, yeah, I guess it makes sense. But I genuinely don't know how to explain it or rationalize it or try to get to a conclusion that is reconciling both in a way that makes sense to everyone. It doesn't. I don't know how to explain
Can I
it.
ask if that's like from other people? Like, do you think you're in that position because of just how other people have made you feel, or is it just like you?
I think everything has to be relative.
your
So I
experience.
think it's relative to people around you.
Okay.
So if I'm talking to you guys, it's so easy because you get it. I don't need to explain
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't need to try to reconcile anything.
Yeah.
But if I'm talking to anyone who is not in that position, it's a nightmare because I don't know how to explain it. So a lot of people who are born, raised Canadian, Anglo-Saxon roots are going to be asking me, like, do you identify as Canadian? The answer is 100% I do when it comes to the things that he's thinking of or she's thinking of. And then when my parents are asking me, you're Egyptian, what's going on? I'm like, yeah, 100%, like I know I am. But mixing that together to people who are not thinking about it the way that I am is impossible.
And I get that, like it changes, right?
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
as you grow. Like I spent 13 years in Lebanon before I came here. And recently, I've spent more time in Canada than I have in Lebanon. And I'm starting to think, wow, like in 20 years, if I'm still living in Canada, what am I going to be like? How's my
Yes.
identity going to change?
So on that note, say like, how have you reconciled it then, bringing those two forces together?
I think it's trying to make sure that I stay connected, or I engage in activities or get involved in the community in ways that make me feel, like I'm honoring my roots, or that at least I'm able to,
To
feel like I'm
reconnect with
connected.
who you are. Yeah.
And I like that word, roots,
Yeah.
because it's kind of like what you said, Reem, like you can identify with whoever or wherever you're from, to a certain extent,
Right.
and at the same time, I've seen a lot of people deny where they're from,
Yeah.
and especially with what's happened in recent
sure.
years,
That's true, yeah.
there's
sure.
that sense of shame.
Yes.
For sure.
And so this is now just another question for you. It's like, what do you think makes someone deny their roots, and why is it important for them to claim their identity in terms of their culture? Like, why are we putting so much emphasis on like culture and a background in a country?
I mean, of course, we can't judge others how they want to identify themselves. I'm going to talk on behalf of like what I've seen from many Syrians, that I know that nowadays they don't want to deal with anything that is happening, the chaos in the Middle East. They're like, you know what? I don't want to deal with what's happening in Syria. I never lived there. I don't want to be identified as a Syrian, because the moment they mention Syria, they're like, there's many questions that would follow up. They want to avoid that, which I understand. Some people they can't handle tough situations, and they don't want to be overwhelmed, so it's their choice. But for me, I think I still identify myself as Syrian Canadian, because I spent my childhood in Montreal. We have family friends who were like family, and I still share my values, so I try to take the best out of both cultures and both worlds, I would say. I'm still connected to my community. I'm very involved with my people and Arabs in general. And at the same time, I try to change the bad habits, the bad traditions and culture that affected us like back a days. And like, you know what, I don't want us to bring our bad traditions here in a society where we don't have to.
Bad traditions? Like, what's defined bad for us?
Like what we were talking about, feminists, like feminism, let's say. How people raise their kids. Like Hassan mentioned, many families don't equally treat their female and male kids. We have to change that.
So then how do you pick and choose the values you go for?
It depends on every person. Like for me, I don't live like a typical Syrian Arab. I live on my own. My parents live in Montreal. I live here. So many people don't like that. I'm like, you know what? It's your problem. I'm trying to be independent. I want to focus on my career. A lot of people are like, oh, she's never going to get married. Oh, she's never, you know what I mean? Exactly. So I think it depends on each person, the values that you want to choose to carry on and to teach your kids.
Exactly. I think that's such a big point. I think people often forget that like you don't have to be the entire thing. Like you don't have to be fully one thing. I think you don't have to just be like, if you're Arab, you have to have all the aspects of your traditional Arab,
everything,
or what they assume a traditional
exactly.
Arab is. I think that's where the problem happens. You can't think, like, for myself at least, like I've lived with my parents for about 18 years. For the past four years now, I've been on my own. When I lived here, my parents are back in Jordan, is where I was like, okay, so they taught me how so many different values and beliefs and whatever for the past like 18 years. It's on me now to say, okay, this is what I'm keeping, this is what I want to work on. And that also came into play in terms of my culture. A lot of different things like feminism or whatever, maybe my parents didn't necessarily address at the time.
So that's great, Rima. I want to go back to the question, why is culture in a country so important for us to attach it to our identity? Or is it even important to begin with?
I think in the day and age that we live in right now, we're so internet, whatever, social media, yada yada, we're so interconnected, and like no matter where you are, like on opposite sides of the globe. And I think with that came the whole, Western culture became a part of like Arab culture, and that's how it kind of increased. And I think when that all started to happen and everything started to get intertwined, we started to kind of, or some of it, again, this is not everybody, but you started to kind of lose sense of who you are, maybe. And so grasping onto concepts like identity and culture and stuff is, I think, for me at least, it's my way to kind of say, oh no, this is who I am. This is a part of who I am. This is how I do my day-to-day. And that's kind of why I feel like for me, identity and culture is such a big thing. Because it helps me go about my life and always think that, okay, this is maybe why you're acting a certain way. It's not necessarily the best logic, but I think that's why.
But it's true. It's true.
I think it's true for a lot of us.
It's just
it definitely is.
It's impossible for you to segregate the two.
Yeah.
You cannot think about any single individual on this planet who is not going to have a connection between the identity that they have and the culture that they were born and raised in, or the culture that they identify with.
So
there's no chance.
So just a follow-up question on that. Let's say, hey, my name is Malik. I go by Malik, and I was born and raised in Tennessee. And you know what? My background, my grandparents came from Syria, but I just grew up, I was born and raised, and I don't really identify with that culture. But
sure.
People now keep saying like, oh no, you're Arab. And I'm like, no, I'm American.
Yeah, but why does that matter what they're saying? Like, you are
100%. Can Malik or Malik deny his roots?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by deny. Like, deny biologically, no. But
I'm like, oh no, Malik, no, you're Arab. And he's like, no, I'm not. I'm a born and raised American.
Leave them be. be.
In a blanket, it's hard to say, but biologically, obviously, he is Arab. But in terms of what he identifies with, then who the hell is to tell him that he doesn't identify with being
So
from
why do
Tennessee?
people do that though? Yeah, no, snap fingers.
Snap
No, but because this is something that we do notice. It's like, hey, no, like this is who you are. We try to impose what we think someone's identity
It's what
should
people
be.
think you are, right? And people just like to put you in a
I
box.
think we're entitled.
We like to
Yeah.
sort people. Like you are a male, I am
Yeah.
she is a female. And the thing with roots is they're technically underground. So how much of the root gets expressed through like the plant or the tree that comes out? So Malik, our American friend, maybe the roots are buried, but they're still there. Whereas with us, perhaps like the roots have blossomed more. There's something on the surface for others to see.
I was gonna say when I was like a kid, I spent 6 years here, like in Vancouver when I was raised here. My parents, they had a pretty big rule, like in the house, nobody was allowed to speak English whatsoever.
Oh yeah, same
So in
here.
the house, it was constantly like, come learn about your Arab roots, come learn about your Palestinian culture, come
Yeah.
learn about this.
Yeah.
And it was for my siblings to keep it and for me to learn it, because I was really young at the time and I was learning English and whatnot at school. And so by default, by the end of like a couple of years, I had taught our like Canadian friends, Ramadan Ghana, Wahawiyah. That's where I was at. Like that's how, for my family, but we know of other families who didn't necessarily have that experience. Like their kids, by default, you know, they moved to North America, they've changed significantly. They're super like, I'm not Arab, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just American.
Yeah.
Or I'm just Canadian.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like it really depends on how you're raised.
100%.
I think to a very biggest extent that comes into play more than anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something, at least that for me, came into play a lot.
I remember actually on that note, like when I first moved to Canada, so I came alone. My parents and my sister, like, they were all in Egypt, and then later on, my mother came and was here. We were having a conversation about whether I was thinking, like I thought, like I was going to stay in Canada or go back to Egypt, like the inevitable conversation. And when we were having the conversation, one of the things that I was mentioning, I was saying like, well, I don't know how I want to raise my kids. Like, do I want to raise my kids as being the way that I was raised in Egypt, or do I want to raise them the way that I know other people are going to get raised, or be raised here in Canada? And she said something like, very interesting. She said, like, if you choose to be here and have a family in Canada, don't try to make them Egyptian. Like she said, it's going to be so confusing and difficult for you to try to force that on them. And just make it natural, because
What is Egyptian? Sorry to interrupt you, but what do you mean by like?
There are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that when we grew up with over there, when it comes to let's give like the basic traditional kind of examples that you're going to see around you. Like if you're Muslim, at least, like you're like praying and like like dealing in certain ways between like men and women, like all these like basic things when you're growing up and all that stuff. Relationships, like all of that stuff. So what she was saying is like, if you're going to be living here, sure, teach them everything you want to teach them, but don't try to force having what you grew up with be what they're going to grow up with in Canada, because it's impossible. In other words, if they don't pray like you used to pray in Egypt, it's like so much harder for them to do being here than it was for you. Like you can't try to bring that and take it here, force it on them, because it's just so hard. So it's 100% exactly what you said. It's like what you've raised on.
Yeah, my parents say the exact same thing. They say one way to help, close the gap is to find an Arab woman, preferably Lebanese, preferably from Beirut, preferably XYZ.
Probably someone we know.
Your cousin.
Yeah. And if you do raise them in Canada, maybe they'll learn Arabic. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, you set the bar really high. This is
That's the assumption.
Yeah.
That's the
That's
usual
true.
how it goes. Like that's
so
the
funny.
expectation, and you're
That's
supposed
true.
to meet that expectation.
Yeah.
So now we're actually jumping into the next segment, which is about third culture millennials. So kind of like what you were saying, Hassan. Like now, your parents, you're as your parents, you grew up in Egypt or wherever in the Middle East, and you come to Canada, and you now raise these kids who both have, your values, and then these new Canadian values. Who here has experienced that, and what was it like? What was one thing that was difficult on top of that for you?
Can I clarify what you mean? Are you saying what it was like for you to try to adapt being in Canada as a Canadian versus coming from Egypt with my background? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say exactly is that right now you would be considered, this is a new category. third culture millennials. And we're going to talk about, whether we even prefer that term. But for now, let's just assume that, this is a whole category where you have these mixed values. So your parents come in, they're coming from these different countries.
Traditional mentalities.
Yeah. And now they come here, and you as a new generation Arab millennial living here, you're now experiencing and getting these different values from the Canadian society. So you have a mix of values. You have some Arab values, and you also have some, Canadian values. And I want to know just right off the bat, what has been something that was difficult for you being a third generation millennial?
I think with my family, to be independent, that was difficult for them to kind of accept that I want to move out, that I want to explore my options, move to a different city. It's not common between Arabs. What are we going to tell like our family back home, cousins, when they ask? Because we mentioned the other episode, it's okay if you want to study, let's say in a specific city, but just to work and just you want to change in your life? No, it's not acceptable. So I had to kind of work on that gradually. A change doesn't happen overnight. It took me years, and I tell them I'm proud of who you are today and the hard work that I did. But they did change. There is hope. And also, I feel like it's a privilege because you get to also experience different cultures, different backgrounds. It did improve my interpersonal communication skills. I was able to accept everybody. I don't judge anybody. I hate to label people. So I think it's something that you can, again, live by taking the best out of both cultures.
Yeah, my parents, we all lived here, and eventually they decided to go back to Lebanon. And they keep saying, like you said, like, when are you coming back? Would you consider moving back? When's your return date? We're excited to have you. And I'm thinking, I really like my life here because it's like a nice blend of everything. My best friends are Chinese, Indian, and Guyanese, and I have a lot of Arab friends, and I feel good. But like I'm that third, that's me. Like I'm that millennial who's like a bit Arab, a bit this, a bit that.
And there's nothing wrong with that. You can be both.
Tell us a little more. Tell the audience a little more. What's it like being a third generation millennial?
It's great.
Great.
Honestly, I really think it's way better than just being born, raised, and what city.
I agree with that. I'm 100% going to agree with that. Because people come from all walks of life. I feel like it's not just that different people come from all walks of life. I feel like I came from all walks of life.
Exactly.
Different walks of life.
Yeah.
Like where I am today is because of my experiences.
Exactly.
Where I was raised in different places, surrounded by people from different cultures. And I think for me, with my parents, it's interesting because they're like, no, you can't come back. No, you have to stay there. But I think for them, they've come to terms with the fact that, our traditional, like the way that we were raised traditionally is good, but in certain aspects, it doesn't work. You won't progress, you won't whatever.
You won't grow, you won't
grow.
Yeah.
And I think for my parents, at least, it was such a big thing. Now, it's not to say, because to answer your question earlier, for me, the two things that they cannot wrap their head around are politics and religion. And the aspect of like, if I sit here today and say, I want to do some sort of activism, even if it's not political, no.
I would say the same thing. I would tell you, I don't know you, and I would say like, that's a bad idea.
But is that because they're you're third generation millennial?
Because that's how we were raised. Like, no, you can't be involved.
The two conversations that you can never have are about politics and religion.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, you can't have those conversations.
Speaking of that, so what do you guys think of Trump? I think it's a...
But I mean, I don't have an answer to that.
It doesn't matter. It was not a real question.
But I think with my parents at least, they've definitely come to terms. Given that I am far away as well, they're a bit more lenient when you're not in the same country.
The relationship is so perfect.
So different.
It's actually true. It's so different.
If you wanted to live with your parents, move out.
On a serious note, it actually, my relationship with my dad improved so much.
You're getting a lot of hate though from parents.
Oh my God.
No, this is true. Me and my dad joke about this. Like we always say, like I don't know how it would have been if I had continued living in Egypt because I was a completely rebellious kid. He's a father, like all fathers. He's not gonna like that.
That's true.
And then when I moved out, like I was far from sight, and that communication was very different.
And I don't mean to kind of bash families, and we
course not.
really value our families and parents, and we know they come from a good place, whatever advice they give to us, even though they live in a different phase or different world. But I think compromising really does help when we kind of meet halfway. We try not to be stubborn and things that we want our way, and at the same time we would expect the same from them. So we can kind of respect what we both need and what we both want.
And does that
at the
help
same
when
time.
you moved out of the house?
Yes.
Or is that what you're trying to get out?
This is the section that's going to cut and send to mother's mom.
It's compromise and understanding. Something
Yes.
that, like, I believe that the relationship that I have with my parents is so strong, more than anything because I am capable of saying, you know what, maybe I don't agree with the mindset that you're in, but I know where you're coming from.
Exactly.
I completely understand why you're telling me that, oh, maybe you shouldn't do this or maybe you shouldn't do that. It's not necessarily them and their lack of trust in me. My parents say this all the time. Oh, it's not you, it's the people around you that we're concerned
Oh,
with.
your parents'
Or it's
favorite
their
line.
mindset, or it's their whatever. But like, we say parents' favorite line, we say all that, but in certain moments, if you take 1 second and you think, okay, logically, why are they telling me to do this?
Yes.
And you remove your personal like emotions out of it, and you just think from their perspective, from a motherly, fatherly
Exactly.
perspective, why are they saying this? I promise you, it completely changes your relationship with them, but also how you go about stuff. Because then within you, you also find that balance. Even if you don't necessarily agree with them, you're gonna say, okay, this is where they're coming from. This is my personal perspective, so let me find a middle ground. And that's at
Exactly.
least something that's like, I am the person that I am today because of that logic.
Exactly.
Because of like understanding that, you know, they're not coming out of nowhere, like they're coming out of something. They're old, they have years and years
They're
of
old.
experience. my parents are, yeah, no, they're not like, there's a very, if I tell you guys, the age gap between my siblings and I is 14 years and 16 years. I am literally
wow.
a different generation.
Okay.
They went through 2 different groups of people.
Yes.
And that's the one thing that like has made me able to meet them halfway. It's just removing my personal like, oh no, I don't want to do that because they're telling me that I should do this, but it doesn't make sense. And just saying, okay, but why? Why are they saying that?
But that's a maturity thing. You
Oh,
were not
100%.
like that. When I was younger, I was not like you.
Oh yeah, totally.
I was the kind of, I was gonna say the thing that they were gonna bring the ship out of. Now I'm like this because like you mature and grow.
I went through that when we were younger.
So
Yeah.
on that note, what
Yeah.
made you guys understand and go through that maturity? Like, what was it that like that moment where you're like, you know what, I want to understand where they're coming from and their why.
I think when you realize how smart your parents are,
Yeah.
it makes
Yeah.
a huge difference.
And when did you realize that?
Very early on, like when I realized that, like, you know, when you have a conversation, then you realize every single time you're having a conversation and you're being rational, they say something and they shut you up. You're like, well, you guys are pretty smart. I think, okay, I can listen. I can probably, yeah, you guys probably have something to say.
Yeah.
So like when you get to that point, you start realizing, okay, like if like very few moments when you're going to be like, they're just being emotional. And if they're being emotional, I'm going to call them on. I'm going to say like this is not making sense.
Okay, and now just kind of in the nature of the topic, when you're now a third generation millennial and you have parents coming from abroad, how do you reconcile kind of, you know, the understanding
Honestly,
and the logic behind
there's-
everything?
There's a very important point to be said here about having, if you're lucky, having a genuine conversation with your family.
Yes.
I'll give you an example about me, for example. I grew up with a dad, like when I was younger, I play music and I love playing music, and I went to my dad's room one time and I said, I'm going to be a musician. He was like, get the fuck out of the room. And it was like not even a conversation. Like, it was like, you know, get out of the room. So anyway, later on, years later, I go to Canada and I'm on track of being a lawyer. I wasn't done yet, and then, you know, everything is going well, you know, they're proud, everything is good. And then later on, I want to I start making videos and I'm really enjoying it. So at that point, I wanted to have a conversation with them about that, right? And in the beginning, it was like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you going? Like, where do you make money? Like, what's going to happen? And then at that point, I decided I'm going to have a conversation about it. And when you sit down, you have a conversation. I was so pleasantly surprised because the conversation shifted my relationship with my dad and my mom completely, because all of a sudden they became my biggest like supporters and biggest cheerleaders, and watching every video being like, oh, the light wasn't too good here, you know, the audio wasn't nice in here. But that kind of conversation is so important, right? But you wouldn't have that if you didn't have that kind of relationship. That's a privilege. That's lucky.
Yes.
Can you like share like how that first conversation went with your parents?
It was bad,
How
right?
you approached it, because I'm curious.
I'll tell you
about
exactly
this.
how it
Approach
works.
makes a very
I'll tell you exactly how it
big
works.
difference.
Yeah.
I was at that point like in my last year of law school, and I wasn't really enjoying what I was studying. And then I started making videos and I loved it and everything went well. And then at some point I was sitting down and I was editing a video and I was in Egypt on vacation.
Yeah.
And my dad would go to work and would come back and would see me sitting on the same spot, just like editing. And then he would be like, don't you have papers to write? Don't you have school to go? And I'm looking at him, I'm like, I've been gone for 7 years and I've been doing just fine in school. Don't worry about my papers. I'm like, I'm okay. And then he kept saying it. And then one time we were sitting down and I was still editing. And then he just like said it. He's like, I don't understand what you do. You're wasting your time. Like, you're supposed to be studying, you're just editing all day. So I just shut my computer and I was like, okay, I'm done. And I just, yeah, exactly. That's it, literally what happened. And I just put my laptop down and I was like, if you guys think that I'm going to be doing this for a day after I finish school, you guys are being very naive. Like, not like in so many words, but basically said like, this is just not gonna happen. And they were both like, what are you gonna do? And then I told them, like, I'm just gonna make videos. I think I'm just gonna make videos for like that part of my life at least. And this is how they started asking questions and they were like, wait, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Eventually that conversation, I explained to them how metrics work and how AdSense works and how, you know, like people make money out of a career like this. And I started like realizing, what are they worried about? They're worried about me having a good life. So I told them I can have a good life from doing something that I love and not just doing something that I realize that maybe I don't like as much. Fast forward to later, now I'm actually glad that we had that conversation because we agreed that I'm going to give it a shot and stay in law for a little bit before jumping the gun and leaving. And in retrospect, that was a great thing to do because today I am enjoying a big chunk of what I do in law. And I still do videos on the side. So
you met them halfway. You were able to kind of.
It wasn't even meeting them halfway. It was just literally realizing that there was a different way. It was a different way to go about it.
Yeah.
It's like a few key words that he said were like listening and understanding and explaining. Those are such big things. Like you have to listen to what they're saying and reason with them as well. Like they have questions, but they probably can't pose them sometimes.
Yeah,
it's like so overcome by emotions, and it's kind of like read between the lines, try to understand where they're coming from. All that stuff, that's what gives you a good conversation.
Yeah.
And I think good timing, like not when
Definitely.
like you both are
Definitely.
you can't stand each other and be like, I'm gonna have a talk with you. No, both parties have to be calm. You have to stop being defensive. You have to listen to what exactly their fears, their concerns, and they have to listen to what you're sharing. So I think it's something that we would expect from both the parents and the.
And if your first approach doesn't work, try another one.
It's never going to happen over one conversation. Like for me, it took time to kind of
And I agree.
reach
And
that
I think
point.
it's one of those things we often underestimate how much our parents know and can actually understand.
Exactly.
yeah.
And it's exactly kind of like the keywords you have identified from Hassan's conversation.
Yes.
Is that listening, that explaining, and what you mentioned, Marwa, is also kind of like being resilient and persistent and to have those conversations.
Having open communication and trust are very important.
Having the courage to say something, and I wonder if because we've like lived abroad and lived everywhere and been moved, we've developed a certain ability to have those tough conversations and advocate for ourselves in ways that others may not, just because they say this is the way it is.
It plays a role, but I think that even when like back in the Middle East or whatever, it was always like there's always a way to meet them halfway, and there's always a way to approach it. If you're gonna sit here and say, "Oh, I can't do this," period, like it's never gonna work. My siblings had a very different relationship with my dad, for example. Like they never felt like they could approach him. They never felt like whatever. When I tell you my relationship with my dad is so close, and they don't even understand how that's possible. But it's because
How is it possible?
How is it possible is because I realized that he's not just trying to fight us. He's not just trying to like be against us on everything. It's more so he wants what's best for us, but maybe he doesn't have the best way of expressing. Like my dad is a very I don't show emotion. You never see me cry. You never anything. So it was me kind of thinking and saying, okay, this is how he is. So what can I do to meet him halfway?
Interesting.
So it was definitely a lot of work for me. Is the point.
So on that note, I'd like someone to just share a story about their experience of convincing their parents, and just one piece of advice for our viewers. One person at a time.
Saeed, you go.
Right, so I told my parents I wanted to study education, and if you're a male Arab, it's kind of a tough sell, and they said, well, can you get a job? And I said, don't worry, I'll get a job. And then I went and I got a job after I graduated. And, it took some convincing, because, they wanted me to be a doctor. And now I'm doing my doctorate, but it's in education. So,
Nice.
yeah,
Oh wow, that's amazing.
you know, you meet them halfway. You gotta
That's
explain
true.
things to them.
Exactly.
You gotta show them, like, by the way, you can get
Exactly.
a job.
Yes.
You know, little steps every day.
Yeah.
So just playing devil's advocate, because this is gonna come in my mind as well as the viewers. Should you always meet them halfway?
I don't
Are there
think so.
times
Well,
where
it's not half,
I don't
like,
think
it's not
so.
like 50-50, but picking your battles, I guess.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
having
Showing
100%.
respect, yeah.
patience.
Picking your battles,
Yeah.
for sure. Picking where you're gonna stand your ground and say, you know what, I'm sorry, but this is what I'm gonna do.
This is my life. This is my
what I'm gonna
choice.
do.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna live the consequences.
Yeah, I promise
Thank
you're gonna
you.
be okay.
Yes.
Because that was my story. It was about like again, just doing social like things that are good for like humanity or like activism work or whatever. That's where I went to them and I was just like, I get it. I know you don't like it, but this is something that makes me happy. And I'm sorry, but like it's gonna happen. And I hope you support me. So it's just literally picking, but I don't do that with everything. I chose to do that there because that was something that I believed to me had so much value. And if I don't stand my ground, I'm gonna beat myself up about it. And then nobody wins then.
If you
Like,
have a good
literally nobody
relationship,
wins.
like if you have a good relationship with them, it's okay to pick your
Yeah.
stand your ground.
But in that, it's also what you choose to tell them, to convince them that what I'm doing is okay, I promise you.
and you shape your own narrative. Like one amazing thing that someone told me back when I don't even know, a couple of years ago. They're like, the story either comes to people or you can bring the story to people. So if you're bringing the story to your parents, you have that opportunity to shape it in whatever narrative the way you want to,
Definitely.
versus it coming to other people.
For sure.
And not to say that even if that's the case, you still have a conversation,
Yeah.
but you have that opportunity to really have, own your
Yeah.
own story and
Definitely.
have, that ownership and lead your conversation.
Yeah.
On that note, we are now ending our other episode of the Yalla Show, where we talked about the identity crisis as well as third culture millennials. Thank you very much for our guests.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, honey.
Thank you.